Chapter 15. Following the failed escape attempt, Will and Evangeline were forbidden to move more than 50 meters from the huts. There was no more running, no more exercising. Eric managed to find a new range of tasks for the two captives to undertake, from reweaving the rope mattresses in the dormitory to resealing the lower planks of Wolfwind's hull with tar and pieces of frayed rope. It was hot, unpleasant work, but Evangeline and Will accepted it philosophically. Confined in this fashion, they couldn't help noticing the growing tension between the two groups of Scandians. Slegor and his men, bored and seeking distraction, had called loudly for the two Oraluans to be flogged. Slegor, licking his wet lips, had even offered to carry out the task himself. Eric, very bluntly, told Slegor to mind his own business. He was becoming increasingly weary of the sneering, bragging manner in which Slegor conducted himself, and of the sly way his men cheated and taunted the crew of Wolfwind at every opportunity. Slegor was a coward and a bully, and when Eric compared him to the two captives, he was surprised to find that he had more in common with Will and Evangeline than with his countrymen. He held no grudge against them for their attempted escape. He would have tried the same thing in their place. Now to have Slegor baying for their hides for his own warped amusement somehow brought Eric closer to them. As for Slegor's men, it was Eric's firm opinion that they were a collective waste of Scourgel's fresh air. The situation exploded one night during the evening meal. Will was placing platters and several carving knives on one table. Evangeline was ladling soup from a large pot at the other, where Eric and Slegor sat with their senior crewmen. As she leaned between Slegor and his first mate, the squirrel suddenly lurched back in his chair, throwing his arms wide as he laughed at a comment from one of his men. His hand jolted against the full ladle, spilling hot soup onto his bare forearm. Slegor bellowed in pain and grabbed Evangeline by the wrist, dragging her forward, twisting her arm cruelly so that she was bent awkwardly over the table. The soup pot and ladle clattered to the floor. "Blast you, girl! You've scalded me! Look at this, you lazy Oraluan swine!" He shook his dripping arm close to her face, holding her with his other hand. Evangeline could hear his breath rasping in his nostrils, and she was uncomfortably aware of the unwashed smell of him. "I'm sorry," she said hurriedly, wincing against the pain as he twisted her arm further. "But you knocked against the ladle." "My fault, is it? I'll teach you to speak back to a squirrel." His face was dark with rage as he reached for the short three-thonged whip that he carried at his belt. He called it his encourager, and claimed that it was used on lazy rowers, a claim disbelieved by those who knew him. It was common knowledge that he wouldn't have the nerve to strike a burly oarsman. A young girl, however, was a different matter, especially now that he was drunk and angry. The room went silent. Outside, the ever-present wind moaned against the timbers of the hut. Inside, the scene seemed to be frozen for a moment, in the smoky, uncertain light of the fire and oil lamps around the room. Eric, sitting opposite Slegor, cursed to himself. On the far side of the room, Will quietly set down the pile of platters. His gaze, like everyone else's, was riveted on Slegor, on the unhealthy flush of alcohol in his face and his eyes, and the way his tongue kept darting out between his crooked, stained teeth to moisten his thick lips. Unnoticed, the apprentice ranger retained one of the knives, a heavy, double-edged knife that was used to carve portions of salt pork for the table. Around 20 centimeters in length, it was not unlike a small sax knife, a knife that he was more familiar with, after his hours of training with Holt. Now, finally, Eric spoke. His voice was pitched low, and his tone was reasonable. That alone made his crew sit up and take notice. When Eric blustered and yelled, he was usually joking. When he was quiet and intense, they knew he was at his most dangerous. "Let her go, Slegor," he said. Slegor scowled at him, furious at his order and the confident tone of command behind it. "She scolded me," he shouted. "She did it on purpose, and she's going to be punished." Eric reached for his drinking cup and took a deep draught of ale. When he spoke again, he affected a sense of weariness and boredom with the squirrel. "I'll tell you once more, let her go. She is my slave." "Slaves need discipline," said Slegor, darting a quick glance around the room. "We've all seen that you're not willing to do it, so it's time someone did it for you." Sensing his distraction, Evanlin tried to twist out of his grip, but he felt her move and held her easily. One of Wolffang's crew, those who were the most drunk, chorused agreement with his words. Eric hesitated. He could simply lean over and knock Slegor senseless. He could do it without even leaving his seat, but that wouldn't be enough. Everyone in the room knew he could best Slegor in a fight, and doing so would prove nothing. He was sick and tired of the man, and he wanted him humiliated and shamed. Slegor deserved no less, and Eric knew how to accomplish it. He sighed now, as if tired of the whole business, and leaned forward across the table, speaking slowly as he might to a less than intelligent being, which, he reflected, was a pretty good summation of Slegor's mental capacities. Slegor, I've had a hard campaign, and these two are my only profit. I won't have you responsible for the death of one of them. Slegor smiled cruelly. You've gone soft on these two, Eric. I'm doing you a favour, and besides, a good whipping won't kill her. It'll just make her more obedient in the future. I wasn't talking about the girl, Eric said evenly. I meant the boy there. He nodded across the room to where Will stood in the flickering shadows. Slegor followed his gaze, as did the others. The boy? He frowned, uncomprehending. I have no intention of harming him. Eric nodded several times. I know that, he replied. But if you touch that girl with that whip of yours, odds are he'll kill you. And then I'm going to have to kill him to punish him. And I'm afraid I'm not prepared to lose so much profit. So let her go. Some of the other Scandians were already laughing at Eric's speech, delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone. Even Slegor's men joined in. Slegor's brows darkened and drew together in rage. He hated being the butt of Eric's jokes, and and most of the others, thought Eric was merely belittling him by pretending that the undersized Aurelian boy could possibly best him in a fight. You've lost your wits, Eric, he sneered now. The boy is about as dangerous as a field mouse. I could break him in half with one hand. He gestured with his free hand, the one that wasn't locked around Evanlin's upper arm. Eric smiled at him. There was no trace of humor in this smile. He could kill you before you took a pace toward him, he said. There was a calm certainty in his voice, and he wasn't joking. The room sensed it and went very quiet. Slegor sensed it too. He frowned, trying to work his way through this. The alcohol had confused his thinking. There was an element here he was missing. He started to speak, but Eric held up his hands to stop him. I suppose we can't actually have him kill you to prove it, he said, sounding reluctant about the fact. He glanced around the room, and his eyes lit on a small brandy cask, half empty, at the far end of the table. He gestured toward it. Shove that cask over here, Svengel, he asked. His second-in-command put one hand against the small cask and sent it sliding along the rough table to his captain. Eric examined it critically. That's about the size of your thick head, Slegor, he said with a thin smile. Then he picked up his own belt knife from the table and quickly gouged 2 white patches out of the dark wood of the keg. And let's say those are your eyes. He pushed the keg across the table, setting it beside Slegor, almost touching his elbow. A murmur of anticipation went through the men in the room as they watched, wondering where this was leading. Only Svengel and Horik, who had served with Eric at the bridge, had some slight inkling about what their Jarl was on about. They knew the boy was an apprentice ranger. They had seen at first hand that he was an adversary to be respected. But he had no bow here, and they didn't see what Eric had, the knife that Will was holding concealed against his right arm. So, boy, Eric continued, those eyes are a little close together, but then, so are Slegor's. There was a ripple of amusement from the Scandians, and Eric now addressed them directly. Let's all watch them carefully and see if anything appears between them, shall we? And as he said that, he pretended to peer closely at the keg on the table. It was almost inevitable that everyone else in the room should follow his example. Will hesitated a second, but he sensed that he could trust Eric. The message the Scandian leader was sending him was absolutely clear. Quickly, he drew back his arm in an overhand throw and sent the knife spinning across the room. There was a brief flash as the spinning blade caught the red glare of the oil lamps in the fire. Then, with a loud thwack, the razor-sharp blade slammed into the wood, not quite in the center of the gap between the two gouged-out patches. The keg actually slid backward a good 10 centimeters under the impact. Slegor let out a startled cry and jerked away. Inadvertently, he released Evanlin's arm from his grasp. The girl stepped quickly away from him. Then, as Eric jerked his head urgently in the direction of the door, she ran from the room, unnoticed in the confusion. There was a moment of startled outcry. Then Eric's men began to laugh and to applaud the excellent marksmanship. Even Slegor's men joined in eventually, as the girl sat glowering at those around him. He wasn't popular. His men followed him only because he was wealthy enough to provide a ship for raiding parties. Now several of them mimicked the raucous yelp that he had let out when the knife thudded into the keg. Eric rose from the bench and moved around the table, speaking as he went. "So, you see, Slegor, if the boy here had aimed for the wrong wooden head, you would surely be dead right now, and I would have to kill him in punishment." He stopped, close to Will, smiling at Slegor as the squirrel half-crouched at the bench, waiting to see what would come next. "As it is," Eric continued, "I simply have to reprimand him for frightening someone as important as you." And before Will saw the blow coming, Eric sent a backhanded fist crashing against the side of the boy's head, knocking him senseless to the floor. Eric glanced at Svengel and gestured to the unconscious figure on the rough wooden floor of the hut. "Throw this disrespectful whelp into his hutch," he ordered. Then, turning his back on the room, he stalked out into the night. Outside, in the clean, cold air, he looked up. The sky was clear. The wind was still blowing, but now it had moderated and shifted to the east. The summer gales were finished. "It's time we got out of here," he said to the stars.